Welcome back to Frightening Shadows, where darkness isn't just a place, it's a story waiting to be told. If you've made it here, you've already walked part of the way down Resurrection Road with Mike. But if you haven't seen Chapter 1 yet, I strongly recommend you go back and experience the beginning. We'll be here, waiting for you to catch up. For those who are ready to continue, let's take a moment to recap. Mike, burdened with a secret from his past, found himself on a dark road. A road where the shadows came to life. Haunted by the vengeful spirit of Resurrection Mary, he's already endured terrifying visions and physical torment. But the question remains, has he truly escaped, or is the nightmare only deepening? Now, as the fog rolls in once again, let's step back into the haunting story of Resurrection Road. And remember, this story's intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. My breath came in ragged grasps as I tried to regain control of my trembling body. The image of Mary's twisted form, her soul-shattering scream, was seared into my mind. I could still hear the echo of her wail reverberating in my skull like an unrelenting migraine. It was as if the very air around me was charged with her rage, her anguish, a palpable force that threatened to consume me. She's here for me. My God, please forgive me, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The wind suddenly picked up, gusting in from the direction of the cemetery, rattling trees and sending a shiver down my spine. The sound of rustling leaves and creaking branches filled the air, but it was the sight that made my blood run cold. I turned my head towards the fence, and there she was, Mary, standing on the top of the hill next to a tombstone. She was more terrifying than before. Her torn white dress, now a dull, dirty gray, seemed to shimmer in the darkness, almost glowing under the faint light of the moon. Her brown hair, once full of life, now whipped around her gaunt face in the wind, tangled and matted, like it had been trapped in the earth for far too long. But it was her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes that bore into me, held me captive. They weren't just looking at me. They were piercing through me, drilling into my soul, dragging out every hidden fear, every ounce of guilt. I couldn't move. My hands clutched the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, yet my body refused to obey the command to flee. I felt like a trapped animal, cornered and helpless. Mary's gaze was relentless, her presence overwhelming. It was as if the air between us had thickened, charged with a malevolent energy that was slowly squeezing the life out of me. Then, without warning, the radio switched on, blasting static noises that filled the car with a cacophony of harsh, grating sounds. It was deafening, the static crackling and hissing like a swarm of angry insects. I tried to switch it off, my hand fumbling for the dial, but it was no use. The sound grew louder and louder, an unbearable assault on my senses. It was as if the radio had a mind of its own, determined to drown out everything else, to drive me mad with its unrelenting barrage of sound. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the static, lost in the chaos that filled my car. My head felt like it was going to explode, the pressure building behind my eyes, threatening to tear me apart from the inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to escape. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I wrenched the car door open and stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and for a moment the world spun around me. I clutched the side of the car for support, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no making sense of it. there was only Mary, standing on that hill, her dead eyes locked into mine, her presence as real and solid as the ground beneath my feet. I could feel her hatred, her rage, radiating off her in waves, washing over me, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between myself and her as possible, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, unable to tear my eyes away from the specter before me. And then, slowly, Mary began to move. She didn't walk. She glided, her feet barely touching the ground as she descended the hill toward me. The wind seemed to carry her, like a leaf caught in a breeze, drifting closer and closer, until she was just a few feet away. I could see every detail now, every tear in her dress, every strand of hair plastered to her face, every hollow shadow that carved out the contours of her lifeless features. Mary emerged from the cemetery's gate, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. She stopped about 40 or 50 feet away from me, the distance between us charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I could see her more clearly now, the details of her torn dress, the way it clung to her emaciated form, the way her hair hung limply around her face, framing her hollow, dead eyes. She spoke then, her voice low and filled with sorrow, as if it had been dragged up from the depths of her torment.
You left her,
She whispered, the words carrying on the wind, cutting through the silence of the night. The accusation in her voice was like a dagger to my heart. I could feel the weight of her words, the truth of them pressing down on me, suffocating me. My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees, the gravel digging into my skin as I pressed my palms into the cold ground. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears welling up in my eyes. "I tried to stop him, but I was just a kid. I was scared. I'm so sorry." But my apology fell on deaf ears. Mary's voice began to echo in my mind, the same words repeating over and over, growing louder and more insistent.
You left her. You left her. You left her!
I clutched my head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. Her voice was inside me, a relentless force that I couldn't escape. The pressure in my skull intensified, the pain becoming unbearable. And then, without warning, a sharp, searing pain shot through my right arm. I screamed as I looked down and saw my forearm twisting, contorting in an unnatural angle, the bones bending in ways they were never meant to. It was as if some unseen force was grabbing hold of my arm, crushing it, breaking it. The agony was indescribable. It felt like my flesh was being torn apart from the inside, the bones splintering and shattering under the immense pressure. I could hear the sickening crunch of bone on bone, the tearing of ligaments and tendons as my arm was mangled beyond recognition. "Stop! Please stop!" I begged, my voice a desperate, pitiful cry. But there was no mercy in Mary's eyes, no pity in her dead gaze. She remained where she was, unmoving, her expression cold and unfeeling as she watched me writhe in pain. The echo of her words continued to pound in my head, her accusation drilling into my very soul. The pain was too much. I couldn't take it anymore. My vision began to blur, the world around me fading in and out as I teetered on the edge of consciousness. But even in that haze of agony, I could still see her, still feel her hatred, her anger, bearing down on me, crushing me. My arm couldn't take the pressure anymore, and I heard a sickening crack as the bone snapped. My right forearm went limp, the pain so intense that it wrenched a scream from my throat. I collapsed on the ground, writhing in agony, my mind barely able to process what was happening. The air was still, too still. Not a soul was around, just the eerie silence of the night. Mary, her twisted, tormented body looming over me, slowly lifted her arm and pointed towards the cemetery on the other side of the fence. I could hardly lift my head to follow where she was pointing. The pain was so unbearable. But as I blinked through the tears, forcing my eyes to focus, I saw something, or rather, someone else. A girl stood there, just beyond the fence, within the cemetery grounds. Her clothes were dirty, but far cleaner than Mary's. There was a small wound on her head, blood matted in her hair, and her arm. My God, her arm was shattered, hanging at an unnatural angle, barely attached to her body. It was a sight that made my stomach churn, but there was something eerily familiar about her. Then it hit me, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. I burst into tears, the floodgates opening as the weight of recognition settled over me. The tears streamed down my face, mingling with the sweat and dirt. It was you! I choked out between sobs, my voice trembling with the realization. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I tried. I really tried. The girl didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, her expression unreadable, her eyes locked on mine. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone, vanished into the shadows of the night. But Mary was still there. Her tormented body still stood over me, watching with those hollow, unforgiving eyes. And then she began to move. Slowly, but unmistakably, she walked towards me. Her steps were deliberate, every movement filled with purpose. When she was just a foot away from me, she reached out with her right arm and touched my chin, lifting it up so that our eyes met. Never in my life had I been so terrified. I was utterly powerless, a prisoner to the nightmare unfolding before me. Her gaze bore into mine, and then, in a voice that was low and filled with an eerie calm, she spoke.
She forgives you.
The words hung in the air, a strange mix of relief and terror washing over me as they settled in. But before I could process what she'd said, the world began to spin around me, the darkness closing in once again. When the world finally stopped spinning, I opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the ceiling. Plain, white, sterile. The smell hit me next, that familiar scent of antiseptic, and the beeping of a heart monitor filled my ears. My arm. It didn't hurt anymore. None of me did. I was in a hospital bed. What the hell? I blinked, trying to push through the fog clouding my brain, and turned my head. The room was small, dim, but I wasn't alone. A figure sat beside me, slumped in a chair, his badge glinting under the pale fluorescent light. A police officer. He noticed me stirring and straightened up, clearing his throat. You're awake. That's a relief. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, like I hadn't moved in days. What happened? My voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. The officer leaned in, his face neutral, but his eyes serious. You've been unconscious for 3 days. You were in a car accident. Pretty bad one, too. You're lucky to be alive. The words barely registered. 3 days? My mind raced. The last thing I remembered was Mary, her hand on my chin, her eyes piercing into me. And then, nothing. Darkness. But that couldn't be real. I couldn't tell the officer that. Car accident? I muttered, my thoughts swirling. I don't remember. He nodded as if he'd expected that. Yeah, that happens with trauma sometimes. You ran off the road just outside of Chicago. They found your car smashed up against some trees. It's a miracle you're in one piece. He paused, studying me carefully. Doesn't seem like you were drunk or anything, but you were in pretty rough shape when they found you. I tried to piece it together, but it didn't make sense. The cemetery, the fog, Mary, it felt so real. Too real. And yet, here I was, alive, in a hospital. Was anyone else with me? No, you were alone, the officer replied, shaking his head. Why, you expecting someone else? I didn't know how to answer that. My mouth felt dry, and my mind was a mess of questions. But I couldn't shake the image of Mary, of the girl. And then Jimmy's face flashed in my memory. The twisted, broken girl accusing me, blaming me. I'd left her. We'd left her. But none of that was real, right? It couldn't be. I forced a shaky breath. So, I just crashed? Looks like you were tired. Maybe fell asleep at the wheel. But no sign of foul play, just an accident. He stood, pulling a notebook from his pocket. Anyway, I just needed to check in. You're stable now, so I'll let the docs take over from here. If you remember anything else, let us know. I nodded weakly, still processing. He gave me a polite nod before leaving the room. As soon as the door closed, the room felt colder. Was that it? Was it all just a nightmare? My mind tried to convince itself. I'd been exhausted, driving for hours. My body probably just gave out. That's it. It's gotta be it. Mary wasn't real. I let out a shaky sigh, feeling the weight lift slightly from my chest. I almost convinced myself, until I glanced at the bedside table. A stack of newspapers sat there, probably left by the nurse. Something to read, to pass the time. But the moment I laid eyes on the front page, my blood ran cold. Man killed in apparent hit and run just outside of Chicago. The headline jumped out at me, but it wasn't the words that made my stomach drop. It was the photo beneath them. Jimmy. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but his face was still there, staring back at me from the black and white image. The article detailed a hit and run on a back road just outside the city. Jimmy had been found dead in the early hours of the morning. No leads, no suspects. My pulse raced, my body numb. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Jimmy was alive. The last time I saw him, he was... My hand shook as I lifted the newspaper to read the small print. every word stabbing through my brain like a hot knife. Jimmy, hit by a car, left to die on the side of the road, just like we'd done to her. My veins turned to ice. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, the room spinning again. I dropped the paper, stumbling out of bed, my legs unsteady beneath me. This was just an accident. It was some twisted coincidence. Mary's voice echoed in my mind, as clear as it had been in that cemetery.
She forgives you.
But the dead have their own justice. I clutched the hospital bed, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body screaming as realization crept in. Jimmy was dead. In the silence of the hospital room, her voice echoed in my mind once more. But this time, it was louder, clearer, more deliberate.
She forgives you!
The words reverberated through my skull, the emphasis on you cutting through me like a blade. Not him, just me. My heart raced, the guilt clawing at my insides. Was that why I was here? Why I survived? Had I been forgiven? Was this some twisted mercy? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I sat there in the hospital bed, staring at the newspaper still lying on the floor where I'd dropped it. The room felt cold, but it wasn't just the sterile air of the hospital. It was something else, something deeper. Jimmy was gone, and Mary, she was still out there. My mind raced with everything that had happened. The cemetery, the fog, her eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, and her voice. That voice still echoed in my skull.
She forgives you!
But how could anyone believe what had happened? How could I even explain it? My right arm throbbed in its cast. I grimaced, trying to flex my fingers, but the pain shot through me like a hot knife. I'd have to do this with my left hand. Awkward, slow, but necessary. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, gripping it clumsily with my left hand. The past always had a way of digging itself up, clawing its way out from wherever I'd buried it. And now, I needed to let it out. Maybe telling the world would help me make sense of it. Maybe it was just my way of warning people. I opened a blank screen. My left hand hovered over the keyboard, shaking a bit. Typing like this would take time, but the words had to come out. They'd been trapped for too long. The thing is, people will tell you that the dead can't hurt you. They'll smile and shake their heads like they know something you don't. The more I typed, the more the burden seemed to ease. But the fear, that didn't go anywhere. It stayed with me, clinging to my every thought. What's waiting out there in the shadows? It knows me. It knows what I've done. Hell, maybe I even deserve it. It was slow work, typing with just my left hand. The pain in my right arm a constant reminder of how broken everything was. But I kept going. The words needed to be out there. People needed to know. For a moment, I almost felt lighter, as if I'd managed to push the weight off my chest. But then the room seemed to grow colder. I glanced towards the window. A thin layer of fog, barely visible, but there, slowly creeping toward the hospital. I blinked, my pulse quickening as I watched it roll in. The same fog from that night. My mouth went dry, my heart pounding in my chest as the mist curled and swirled, inching its way toward the building. Toward me. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I wanted to move, to run, but I was frozen in place, gripped by the same fear that had held me outside the cemetery. The fog thickened, swirling just outside the window now, wrapping around the lamppost like fingers reaching for something. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What about Mary? I sighed and pressed submit. And now, as the fog settles and the shadows close in, we leave Mike alone in the darkness. But is this truly the end of his story? Or is it the beginning of something far worse? What awaits him in the silence, and what will rise from the shadows? Some journeys don't end when the sun rises. But let me ask you this. Do you think Mike deserved what happened to him? The road ahead is uncertain, and we want to know your thoughts. Share your theories, your suspicions, and whether you think Mike's fate was sealed from the start. And, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and check out more chilling stories like this.